Picture this, just an ordinary Monday. You show up to work and there by the wall in the office hallway, a nurse is standing and waiting for you with a tailor's measuring tape in her hand. You walk up, lift your shirt, and she wraps the tape around your belly, right at the navel. She looks at the number and writes it down in your file. Sounds absurd? Well, that's what the yearly checkup looks like at a Japanese company, written into the law. Every adult between the ages of 40 and 74 has to go through it. But the size of your waistline doesn't stay between you and the nurse. If too many people on staff fall outside the limit, the employer has a problem on their hands. The company has to pay a penalty because its own workers carry too much around the middle. The cutoff for men is 85 centimeters, for women it's 90. One of the giants of Japanese electronics, back when this law was coming into force in 2008, sat down and calculated how much it could cost them if their workers didn't slim down. $19 million. Let's stop here for a second, because the argument about obesity almost always comes down to comments about willpower. If you want it, you'll lose the weight, and if you don't, that's on you. But instead of boxing ourselves into that mindset, let's look at something the conversation almost always leaves out: the environment around us. I'm talking about the things we don't even notice, the things that quietly make our choices for us every single day. And this environment, both in Japan and here in Poland, has a history, a way it came to be. So what comes up when you type into a search engine, "Why don't the Japanese get fat?" You'll get hundreds of articles and videos, and almost all of them land in one of two places. First, discipline. The Japanese have iron willpower, they eat small portions, they know how to tell themselves no. The second is genes. They just have those bodies. A different metabolism, a different build, an Eastern nature. Both answers sound familiar. They fit the way we picture the Japanese, and both are false. Let's start with the one that pretends to be the most scientific. Genes. Japan is a chain of islands cut off from the rest of the world by nature. And on top of that, the country spent more than 200 years sealed almost completely shut. Outsiders weren't allowed in, locals weren't allowed out. So generation after generation, the same gene pool kept mixing within itself on and on for centuries. When someone says Japanese bodies simply work differently, it doesn't sound absurd to us at all. It sounds like biology. The thing is, a claim like that is easy enough to test, because if genes were the thing keeping the Japanese in check, then wherever we move them, they would stay slim. After all, the gene travels along with the person. So let's go ahead and move them. Late in the 19th century, a huge wave of Japanese emigration takes off. Out to the sugarcane plantations of Hawaii, into American cities. The same people, the same island gene pool we were just talking about, board a ship and step off into a completely different world of food. And here's where the numbers stop fitting the genetic theory. For half a century, researchers compared the Japanese who stayed home with Japanese migrants in Hawaii and Los Angeles. Obesity and diabetes show up far more often in the ones living in America. Diabetes alone runs at about 18% in Hawaii versus 6% back in Japan, 3 times as many. And the ones who gained the most weight were the second generation, the ones already born in the States. The supposed gene for Japanese slimness stayed untouched. The only thing that changed was what that body was getting on its plate every single day. Noon, a Japanese elementary school. The bell rings, but nobody runs to the cafeteria because there isn't one. Lunch comes straight to the classroom. Children in little white aprons and caps, like tiny cooks, carry in pots of soup and rice. They serve the portions to their classmates themselves, ladle the soup into the bowls themselves. No adult hands out the food here, the kids take turns doing it on rotating duty. And this isn't a break for eating, this is a lesson. Let's go back a few hours into the kitchen to see how this lunch was actually made. At an elementary school on the outskirts of Tokyo works Yoshi, a certified school dietitian by training. Her day begins with counting. Every morning Yoshi gets 2 numbers. The first one is calories. A single lunch is supposed to come in around 650. The second is the budget. 282 yen a plate, about $1.50 for a child's whole lunch. Easy to say, much harder to pull off because this is supposed to be a full nutritious meal. And on top of that, one the kids will actually eat. This school is no exception. The system has been running for over 70 years in thousands of Japanese elementary schools. And during that same lesson, something else is happening. The teacher eats together with the kids, helps himself to a big pile of vegetables. After lunch, the fight begins over what's left in the pots. The whole class lines up for rock, paper, scissors for seconds. When the kids see their teacher happily digging into his vegetables, they follow his lead. The winner gets a second helping of broccoli. At the end of lunch, a bin for food scraps is set out. It sits there empty. Not a single gram of food was thrown away. And notice that nobody in this classroom gave the kids a lecture about obesity, nobody banned their sugar or tried to scare them. The children are given an example, and from the earliest age, a habit gets built into them. It's easy to fall in love with this picture, to think this nation has it all wonderfully figured out. But where did this system actually come from? That's something Japan isn't all that keen to talk about. To see how this Japanese school lunch really began, you have to go back almost 80 years to Japan right after the war. The country is in ruins, everything is in short supply, and the children are malnourished. And in that reality, the first meal shows up in the classrooms, a slice of bread. Later, powdered milk joins it. Japan is under American occupation, and it's no accident that this lunch looks exactly the way it does. On the occupier's side, there's one man whose name comes up the most: Brigadier General Crawford Sams, an American military doctor, head of the public health section in the occupation command. And Sams didn't think of the school lunch simply as food. He thought of it as a tool, and that tool, from the very start, was aimed at children. The key to this overhaul, in his view, was animal protein, above all milk, which he saw as a nearly perfect product. This was no accident. This was the decision of an American doctor who wanted to turn Japanese children into stronger, taller, healthier people. But there was a cold political calculation behind it. The Cold War was on, and Japan sat right next to communist China and the Soviet Union. In the occupier's calculation, a hungry child was a risk too. Its parents might just rebel and go looking for hope among the communists. So a well-fed child wasn't only healthier, it was also proof that the American way of doing things worked better than the Soviet one. The school plate became a quiet tool in the fight over which direction post-war Japan would take. So where did this milk and bread come from? Not from a Japanese field, but from an American warehouse. Right after the war, America had its warehouses full, stockpiles left over from the military and from years of production for the front. And on the other side of the ocean were hungry Japanese children. So part of those stockpiles was loaded onto ships and sent off. Sacks of flour and powdered milk landed straight in Japanese schools. Later, that American aid came to an end. In 1951, Japan regained its full independence, and along with it, the free deliveries from across the ocean disappeared. And suddenly, there was a problem. If the Americans aren't paying anymore, who pays for these lunches? The bill fell on the parents. But for many families, it was too much, and school lunches started disappearing. And that's when something happened that shows how attached the Japanese had already grown to them. A campaign started up across the country for the state to take over the cost and save the program. Parents, schools, and even the politicians pushed hard to keep the lunches from being scrapped. And in the end, it worked. This emergency program from the occupation turned into a permanent institution of the state. Back in 1954, Japan passed its law on school feeding and nutrition. Now look at what happened next. The reason food was flowing from America to Japan had changed. American farming after the war was producing far too much, and Japanese schools turned out to be a convenient market to dump it. A few years later, the two countries signed a deal on it. Feeding the hungry had quietly become a business. Now, just a quick side note here, so we don't oversimplify. It's not as if the Americans invented school lunches. The idea itself had existed in Japan much earlier. The first meals showed up there back at the end of the 19th century. But it was the Americans who swapped their rice for bread and their soup for powdered milk. They changed the whole pattern of what lands on a child's plate. In post-war memories, from different ages and parts of Japan, the same thing keeps coming back. Skimmed powdered milk mixed with water came out lumpy, with a strange smell and a taste that children couldn't stand. Some people remembered drinking it while pinching their nose shut. For many, though, it was a rescue from hunger. But the disgust at that milk comes back in the accounts over and over. And this is exactly the paradox. The school lunch system that half the world envies today began with a country in ruins, and something Japanese children were spitting back out. And now comes the thing that's the whole heart of this story, because Japan didn't stay with the American model at all. From the 1960s on, it begins to deliberately reverse it. In 1962, rice comes back to school lunches. Cautiously at first, because something had to replace the American flour. Then, the powdered milk slowly started giving way to ordinary milk. Until in 1976, rice was written permanently into the system by a separate regulation. This was no small tweak to the menu, it was a complete reversal of direction. Japan took the model it had been handed from the outside and turned the whole thing back around toward its own kitchen. The same state that in the 50s was pushing the child toward a Western plate, 2 decades later began pulling it away again. And if it had simply ended right there, this would be a lovely little story about a system the rest of us could only envy. A system that genuinely looks after the health of its own citizens. But let's get back to those tape measure checkups at work. First, let's pin down what being slim actually means, because a slim figure isn't yet the same thing as a healthy body. Dr. Toshio Ishikawa heads the Japanese Society for Eating Disorders. In a piece for the BBC, he said a belief has taken root there that thinness is beautiful, and that by now it has gone far, far too far. You can be slim on the outside and not healthy on the inside. Doctors have a term for it, skinny fat. And I'm not talking about some skinny person with a beer belly. This most dangerous fat sits deeper, wrapping itself around our organs. You can have way too much of it even though you don't look heavy at all. In Japan, they ran CT scans, and it turned out that among people at a normal weight, almost 1 in 4 men and 1 in 12 women were carrying too much of this inner fat. And on top of that, the Asian body is worse at storing fat under the skin. It puts it away faster on the inside instead, around the organs. That's why a Japanese or Chinese person can develop diabetes at a weight where a European would still pass as perfectly healthy. Visceral fat pushes the belly out from the inside. You won't see it like a spare tire, but you can catch it on the measuring tape. Before someone jumps into the comments to say I'm exaggerating, because come on, Japan has like 4% obesity. Yes, that's true, but only if you count the way the West does. From a BMI of 30, Japanese doctors though count from 25. And then it turns out that in middle age, roughly 1 in 3 Japanese men is overweight. In December 2005, Japan announces a sweeping healthcare reform. This law wasn't born out of politicians suddenly caring about their citizens. It was about money. The state was looking for ways to bring down the rising cost of treatment and preventing lifestyle diseases, landed straight in a spending cut program. They wrote down a specific target, cut the number of people with metabolic syndrome by a quarter by the year 2015. And that target was never hit. A study of over 8 million adults showed BMI rising across every age group. And in 2024, the ministry itself admitted that obesity among Japanese men had been climbing for the last 10 years, despite all those checks with the measuring tape. So, this famous inspection we so admire actually failed to meet its own goal. So if Japan went back to rice and healthy fish in its schools, then surely it didn't fall for Western fast food either. Unfortunately, it did. McDonald's is doing great over there, and in the last decade, its revenue has climbed by more than 100%, while the Japanese meals are some of the most calorie-packed in the world. A plain burger in Japan has 259 calories, in the US 250. The average Japanese serving of rice is no smaller than the American. Same with konbini, round-the-clock shops on every corner, even denser than Żabka, the convenience chain we have in Poland. They've got a reputation for fresh food. Onigiri, salads, soups made on the spot. And yes, all of it is sitting right there, except that research from the University of Tokyo shows that as much as half the calories an average Japanese person eats come from highly processed food. This is not a nation living on healthy low-calorie meals. They've drifted into packaged convenient food too. Just like we have in Poland, we picture the Japanese drinking nothing but green tea, say, when in reality there's a vending machine full of sugary drinks on every corner over there. So what does it look like in Poland? Let me start with something easy to miss, because we tend to judge the world through one small slice of our own lives. If you're trying to eat a bit healthier and you play some kind of sport, for instance, then chances are the people all around you care about it too, and you just assume most Poles have it under control. They don't. You've simply gone and built yourself your own supportive environment. Everyone else lives in the one that was forced on them. And what does that look like? At the end of last year, Żabka had over 12,000 stores across Poland and Romania. 1 in 3 Poles lives less than 300 meters from one of them. Except that our version of the kombini doesn't have that second healthier shelf. In Poland, what pulls people inside is cheap calories, a hot dog for about $1, candy, energy drinks and booze. And this isn't some private theory of mine, because Polish doctors talk about a so-called obesogenic environment too. Surroundings where highly processed, addictive food is everywhere. The packaging gets prettier and prettier, and advertising goes after us from childhood, using our idols and the cartoon characters we look up to and trust to do it. Japan has state-level prevention we don't have a trace of in Poland, and even so, the obesity problem still shows up over there. And here in Poland, our environment starts us off from a much worse place. So we'd need measures far stronger and far more effective than theirs. I'm not trying to blame anyone or scare anyone. It's a good thing when we look out for each other and care for one another as one nation. And on top of that, it's simply our shared economic interest. Because look at this absurdity. We spend money at corporations that wreck the environment we live in, and then our taxes go to treating us. It's like trying to put out a fire by dousing ourselves in gasoline. Another difference between Poland and Japan is steps, movement built into every day. A morning in Tokyo is crowds of people walking to the metro. You walk to the next station. Between transfers, you're on foot. The average Japanese person takes over 7,000 steps a day. And what about here in Poland? The car pulls out right from the front door. The same kilometer a Japanese person walks, a Pole drives. Poland has 611 cars per 1,000 people. In a decade, we've climbed from 16th to 6th place in the EU on that count. But is changing the environment on the scale of a whole country even really possible? The 1960s, Finland, a nation that, back then, holds a grim world record. Nowhere else do men die of heart disease this often, and inside Finland there's one region that's the worst of all, a poor forested province up against the border with the Soviet Union. Men there die on average 10 years earlier than the ones in Southern Europe. Why is this happening? What they've got on their plates? Historians will later call the most dangerous diet in the world. Loads of butter, full-fat milk, and pork. Vegetables, in their minds, are food for animals. Finnish cows were bred specifically for fat. Subsidies for farmers were calculated from the fat content in their milk. The fattier the milk, the bigger the bonus from the state coffers. This region didn't give up. For years, scientists kept coming, counting the death rates and diagnosing diseases, without ever solving the root of the problem. Until, at some point, the people who lived there simply said enough. In January of 1971, they signed a petition. They demanded that the state finally solve this problem. That's when Pekka Puska shows up, a 26-year-old, freshly minted doctor. He was chosen, as he later joked, not because he was good, but because he was young. His boss knew solving this problem would take whole decades, so they needed someone who'd live to see it. Puska starts out the way anyone would. Leaflets, posters and meetings where ordinary people are told to eat less fat and use a little less salt. The result of all that? Almost none at all. And that's exactly when the thought occurs to him that to bring about any real change, he'll have to rebuild the entire system around people. Their shops, their cafeterias, whatever they've even got within reach. Instead of fighting people, Puska changes the world around them. He strikes a deal with an organization of countryside homemakers. Together, they set up village gatherings, cooking traditional dishes in a healthier version. They bring in vegetables too. Puska trains over 800 ordinary residents, mostly women, and he turns them into local health ambassadors. He goes to the local butcher and talks them into putting less fat and salt in the sausage and swapping part of the meat for mushrooms, which the forests around there are full of. He wants people to spread their bread with a mix of butter and oil instead of pure butter. But Finnish law forbids it, so his team goes to parliament and pushes the law through to change it. And then comes the most important move of all. Since the state had paid farmers for the fat in their milk, that needed flipping around, and flip it they do. At the end of the 80s, Finland changed its subsidy rules. They stop rewarding fat and start rewarding protein. I'm talking about this as if it were one unbroken string of successes. All of it simple. But it wasn't that easy. The dairy industry launches a counterattack. It buys up ads that openly go after Puska's project. The doctor admitted years later that the country's dairy sector poured enormous resources into defending its own interests, except that this particular war ended with a bit of irony because the ads, instead of sinking the project, kicked off a nationwide debate about fat and heart health. Some cardiologists literally mock Puska in public. They say what he's doing makes no sense, but people already trust him by now. They saw that he actually cared about them. He explained later that he couldn't just walk up to the Minister of Agriculture and order him to shut the dairy industry down, because that would never have worked. But once people stopped buying from that industry on their own, it had no choice but to change. And what did this change in the environment actually bring about? Heart disease deaths among men fell by 80%. The press started calling it the miracle of the North, except it wasn't any kind of miracle, it was consistent, steady work. Why did this plan succeed? Because there was a tight-knit community there, people united, and that's our strongest weapon. Through the media and propaganda narratives, politicians do everything they can to get us attacking one another and never reaching any agreement. Every single time we so much as touch on this subject, it irritates me just the same. The fact that we keep falling into such simple traps. But coming back now to Finland, one researcher added one more thing to this success, that betting on education alone did nothing there at all. The real breakthrough came only once the structure itself had been rebuilt. Cheap access to fatty food was taken away. Topics connected to Japan fascinate me, and I hope they do you as well. But some of these things are simply worth demystifying. And if one thought is to stay with us after this film, I'd want it to be this one, about the environment. Even if changing all of society is beyond our reach for now, we're still left with our own environment. And if you know of other interesting mechanisms from different countries worth taking a closer look at, write them in the comments. I'd be glad to dig into them. See you next time. A 7-year-old Jackie Chan lands in a school whose contract allows a student to be punished, all the way up to death. No contact with his parents, 18 hours of training a day, and a beating with a bamboo cane for every mistake. Click the thumbnail and see the real price he had to pay to become a legend of action cinema. This is called Lemon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in just a moment.